And I'm really excited that I'm here today with Rowena Seabrook from previously Amnesty International UK Human Rights Education Team. And we are going to be diving in more detail to a couple of different aspects of Agile which aren't talked about as much, specifically the impact that embedding Agile ways of working can have on your everyday work. We often hear it talked about in terms of how it can really help to deliver projects and products. We are hoping to dive into in more detail today the positive impact it can have on your day-to-day business as usual everyday work, and also how Agile ways of working can be really focused on people. We're talking team well-being, connection, agency, decision-making, all of those aspects that again can sometimes be overlooked in a focus on Agile bringing efficiency and prioritization. So we're really excited to be talking to you a little bit more about how Agile can create a more caring environment for our teams focused on well-being. So I'm really, really excited to ask Ro to introduce herself. And would you tell us a little bit more about you, Ro, and your role at Amnesty when you were there?
Sure. Hi, I'm Ro, and I was Human Rights Education Manager at Amnesty International UK until June this year. So I currently work for the Open University, and I'm mostly found buried in trying to write my PhD thesis. So I have warned Eleanor to give me a hand signal if I seem to be drifting off into thesis world, which is where my head is mostly. I was at Amnesty for nearly 9 years, most of that time as Human Rights Education Manager, started in a different role, and in my final months at Amnesty, I was also job sharing that role with somebody else. Yeah, but I'm very excited to talk about Agile as it's one of my favourite topics. So good to be here.
Thanks, Ro. Before we dive into the kind of story, I'd love you to give a sort of chronological overview of your interaction with Agile ways of working. Would you tell us a little bit more about what the Human Rights Education Team do at Amnesty? And your role within that?
Yeah, so we are quite a big education team for an NGO or a charity. So we're unusual in that regard, and also unusual in that we do projects with adults as well as children and young people. So and that we work with schools, but also with projects outside schools. So globally, Amnesty has a focus on human rights education, and that can look quite different in different countries and contexts. In the UK, there's a lot of work trying to support teachers with their training and confidence in relation to talking about human rights and delivering human rights education, and then also working with young people, not only in terms of their knowledge of human rights but their skills, so young activists as well, and then working with creative organizations, artists, around kind of freedom of expression and using things like poetry for educating about human rights, and then perhaps more traditional activist skills education for activists of all ages, around the knowledge they need, but also skills around organizing, influencing politicians, and so on. So it's quite a varied area of work in terms of what the team does.
Thanks, Ro. And I know some of the team are here today.
Yeah, you can chip in. Yeah, so I was the team leader, essentially, the team leader for most of the time that I was at Amnesty, which is a kind of I think of it as a sort of player manager role. So although we're quite a big team, I was always doing delivery or supporting delivery, as well as being involved in kind of then leading and managing the team.
Thanks, Ro. So would you tell us about how you first heard about Agile ways of working and take us on that? Tell us that
Sure.
story.
So Eleanor will remember we had a meet cute in the Amnesty offices in Shoreditch. I was literally walking into a meeting room to do something about children's literature, which is a speciality of mine, as Eleanor and a colleague were coming out. My colleague introduced me to Eleanor and was like, you need some of this because it's transformed my life. And I was like, I do need some of that. I could do with something transforming my life. And then it sort of took off from there. So it was very accidental. I mean, I often think of like what would have happened. I spoke to the colleague you worked with quite a lot, so I think it would have come to me eventually. But I think the timing of it, because I was really struggling with a particular project that I was responsible for, and I was also mulling on my kind of then leadership style and how to kind of more effectively get out of the way of people in the team and create more space for people to have more kind of agency in the team. So I was in a particular headspace that when I said, I need some of this transformation. And so then we began talking. So the initial conversations were very much about the project that I was working on that I felt very stuck with, and I couldn't quite see a way forward, except that I knew I needed to collaborate on it, but I didn't know how. And then the things that I was thinking about leadership. But by the time we actually started using a Scrum approach, a lot had changed. So I think probably, Julia, it was the start of 2021. I think it was January 2021 when we held our first kind of sprint workshop. There'd been work happening in the months before with the team, and so everything had changed. Like, how we delivered our work had changed overnight with the pandemic, because we were often on trains with suitcases full of stuff, going and delivering face-to-face training, having face-to-face meetings, all of that kind of thing, and everything had changed overnight. And of course, like many organizations similar to Amnesty, we'd moved to remote working, which is not how we'd been working before. And then everybody was also like experiencing the pandemic in their own way. So by the time we actually started, the needs were different, and the team articulated that the needs they had were around wanting to feel more connected to each other in a what was still remote at that point, hadn't moved to hybrid way of working, more connected to their work, which had changed so dramatically in the previous 6 months, more able to collaborate. We've been a very collaborative team, but we're used to doing that in person. So what did that mean? Because there were quite kind of siloed projects and programs that people were working on. So to have that sense of being able to collaborate, being able to contribute to other people's work, and also feel confident asking for contributions, asking for support in a slightly more formal, remote way of working, when we weren't just like next to each other at desks. And then really, most importantly of all, everybody was like, we want to like center, maybe recenter our well-being, because it was such a time of dramatic change and challenge, and that was something that had always, the team had always cared strongly about, but you know, things had shifted around us and the experiences were very different. So we had this very clear set of needs, and I knew through all the conversations I'd had with you, Eleanor, that this would be a way of working that had potential to meet those needs. But then actually I went off for 3 months on sabbatical. So the people covering my my role and then the team had been then talking to Eleanor and Julia, and had some time without my kind of over enthusiasm for it, maybe, to kind of mull on it and see if they thought it had potential too, so that when I came back in the January 2021, we're like, great, everybody's been having these conversations, everybody's had some coaching, let's try it and see what happens. And so one of the things that I really would hope is a takeaway from our conversation today was, although it was in a very specific context, actually, I think the team would say, and some of them are here, so they can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the team would say that actually it's so important to the day-to-day working. It's ideal for like periods of challenge, but in nearly 20 years of like managing teams. I've never had a period where it hasn't been a roller coaster. So the pandemic is a particular kind of context, a particular extreme, but that's not been my experience. Hasn't been all like this. We have huge like swathes of time where it's all plain sailing. That's never been my experience. And the agile way of working and the Scrum way of working has really addressed a lot of needs that I think are ongoing, regardless of, you know, the sort of particularity of COVID-19.
Thanks, Ro. So it sounds like you're saying it was not only useful through this sort of gigantic pandemic change, but it also has continued to enable you and the team, and now the team without you, to continue to work in a way that centers their well-being and enables them to adapt to whatever multiple changes coming their way.
Yeah, and I think also a really important thing, and we found this, certainly this was my observation in 2020 initially, when we were like, how are we going to do our jobs now? Like, what are we going to do? And what do people need from us now in this context? And one advantage that we had was that therefore a lot of our work time was spent learning how to do things, or how to do things we sort of knew how to do online courses, do online facilitation, create meaningful connection in a remote way that we'd sort of started experimenting with, but we had to learn to do that very quickly to a much higher skill level. And then I think the same, and this was certainly my experience, that one of the sort of additional benefits of starting to work in an agile way was it provided a focus for learning and development that in itself I found extremely helpful and comforting during a really difficult time, and positive, right? Like it was gaining skills, gaining knowledge and awareness and understanding of things in a way that wasn't necessarily talking about the specifics of the context all the time. So I think it had quite a nourishing, I certainly found it had kind of a kind of nourishing impact in that regards too.
Brill. I wonder if you would dig into a little bit more for us what sort of activities the team did, and that you helped to lead within the team. So it sounds like you identified that there were specific needs within the team. They wanted to really center their well-being. They needed to be able to deliver work when everything around them was changing. What were some of the things that you and the team tried to embed the agile principles? Did you talked about using Scrum, you talked about reflecting regularly together. What were some of the things that you tried, and how did that go?
So we worked on a monthly sprint cycle. So we would have a sprint at the start of a 4-week period, a sprint planning day, which over time like shrunk a little bit in terms of the amount of time we spent doing it. So have a workshop mapping out what is coming up across all the different projects and areas of work, of which there are like 8 or 9 before you get into like just the sort of business as usual type things. What is happening, who's doing what, does everybody know what they are kind of expecting to do over the next 4 weeks? We have that then all in one place, which in itself was a useful activity because it was a great way of helping people connect to each other's work, know more, be transparent. It meant that I didn't have to hold so much in my head because everybody could see what the sort of bigger picture was of what was happening across the team, which was great because my head was sort of shrinking through the pandemic, my capacity for holding things in my head. And then from that, be able to identify 2 sprint goals that we regularly came back to this because Julia worked with us for some months kind of running these sessions and then like being in the sessions as we run them and so on. But the key thing was like what work is going to benefit from all of us contributing, because we weren't, occasionally there were times when there was like one project or one piece of work that everybody was involved in directly in a more kind of traditional way for agile, but there were definitely times when that wasn't the case. But that didn't mean that there weren't things which were either sort of all hands on deck, or this work will be much better if we create space for everybody to contribute, and therefore have to look at, you know, people's individual work plans and so on. And it also created that space for what people had been saying in the team, which is, you know, I know I've got skills that are useful beyond what I'm doing, and so I want to kind of be useful to other areas of work, as well as I'm really interested in developing in, you know, X, Y, or Z, you know, what are the opportunities? So it just allowed us to map that out and then set a couple of priorities, but with the understanding that individually people also had their own priorities and deadlines and so on. And then we would, after 2 weeks, we would have a mid-sprint check-in, which was really great for kind of going, not only are we on track with the sprint goals, like what's happening, with the really key questions of like, does everybody feel that they're able to contribute, or do some people feel like we just don't know what this is, it doesn't feel very connected for us, but also those overall tasks, like do people feel like they're on track with where they individually had hoped to be at this point, and if not, what can we do about it? And that became a sort of collective responsibility. People were collectively bought into that, of like, how can we enable each other to achieve what we need to achieve? And then we would have the at the end of 4 weeks an end of sprint reflection, so we called them reflections rather than retros. And again, that was really great. We were really good, we were always really good at short-term planning and long-term planning, but that more kind of mid-level planning, like as we went through, was really helpful to go, where are people at, also how are people doing? A month is a long time in people's lives, a lot can happen in and outside work in 4 weeks, so like, what has happened, what do we need to do? And also then as we went into the next sprint cycle, it enabled us, I think, to be more realistic about, okay, the things we'd imagined we were going to do in March, are we actually going to be able to do it? Or have we only been able to achieve some of what we wanted to in February? And therefore, do we need to look at it again? And then that becomes a prioritization exercise. And then we didn't have stand-ups. Lots of teams I know have stand-ups every day. We had them twice a week, because we also had then a team meeting and other more informal things, and just the structure of that. And they were less like, how are the sprint goals going, and more kind of like, what's everybody working on, what's blocked, and most importantly, like, how is everybody doing? So there were these great opportunities that were trying to compensate for the old ways when we would all have been in the office. The stand-ups were like, what is happening, focused on the work, but also focused on the people, in the way that the more informal conversations that would happen in the office, you know, first thing in the morning might be as well. So as far, like, certainly up until the end of June this year, that had been the cycle, the 4 weekly cycle. Occasionally we go, right, actually realistic, this needs to be 6 weeks, or we go, we're not going to do one in December, because December people are only here for 2 weeks, so we're going to tidy up and whatever. But pretty consistently we kept them in. And then just the final thing to say, I guess, about like how we implemented it is, we didn't have a scrum master, which I know people do, because it was new to all of us. So everybody, we had a rota, so everybody ran all of the sprint ceremonies at some point. Most of the time we tried to pair people up, and then that could be more flexible as we all got more confident. So Julia, I think you were with us for several months, kind of gradually sort of stepping back, but we used mural boards, and of course we're a team of educators, right? So it actually it gave us a space to be doing some of what we love to do a bit more frequently than perhaps we were doing, because of as things shook down from the pandemic. So we were essentially kind of running workshops with each other. There's a lot of enthusiasm for different themed boards and icebreakers and all of that kind of stuff, and also meant that where we were pairing people up and we had new members of the team joining and whatever, it meant that people had that kind of opportunity to connect with each other on a, you know, a little task, and then get to kind of share their kind of enthusiasms and ideas and creativity with each other, as well as the kind of getting the job done, as it were.
Thanks, Ro. Something both Julia and I loved seeing in your team that we really encourage all teams and organizations to do is you didn't just kind of take a process off the shelf that you might see a technology team using or a software development team using and just implement it whole hog. You actually looked at the agile principles and thought about, what does this look like for us? We are not software developers, we are educators. What's important to us? What value do we want this to add? And you built your structures around the value that you wanted them to add. So just as you said, you didn't stick, your stand-ups were less off, they weren't every day, they were less often, and they were more focused around well-being. So we love watching the team build their agile ways of working sort of from the ground up based on the principles.
And I think that was I mean, I suspect later you might want to know about surprises, but one of the things that surprised me that if you'd have asked me ahead of time, probably wouldn't, but the collective personality we had with the team we had at the time in early 2021 to get it right was something I hadn't quite anticipated. So that sort of learning that flexibility, that tension between default, especially as Julia stepped back, defaulting to what we were most comfortable with, as opposed to like the confidence we were trying to build in the process and what the process brought to us, which was new for us. So that kind of tension, but also not over investing in the process so much, be like, well, no, this is the way it should be done because we've got this list of instructions. And collectively we sort of had that approach. Like we had to kind of spring into summer 2021, we really had to kind of be like, it's okay, we can trust this process. We don't, as we got more familiar, and then that enabled us to take ownership over it, and it just benefited that none of us were an expert in it, and so therefore like we were all in it together. A horrible phrase, but yeah, it was a shared experience is a better phrase.
Thank you. And as I was saying at the beginning, you and I have talked quite a lot about how agile ways of working are often brought in to achieve things like efficiency, faster delivery, and something that you and the team were most focused on was the impact that agile ways of working would have on your well-being and motivation and clarity of goals. What were some of the ways that I guess you took those established ways of, those new ways of working and really focused them on achieving that improved well-being? Or yeah, I know you talked about, for example, having your stand-ups and the really focused on how are we each doing, how is that, rather than how is the work going. Can you tell us a little bit more about other ways that you found to play around with those structures to enable you to really focus on team well-being?
Yeah, I mean, I should probably start by saying that my understanding of well-being in a workplace is that if you have accountability, transparency, if you have clear purpose, if you have clear prioritization, if people feel that they know what is expected of them and are able to articulate their needs and that those needs will be met as far as possible, all of those things are the foundations of well-being. So the foundations of things that are good work, and then people do like great work because they're enabled to do so. So also part of that is about like connection, especially as people moved remote and then to hybrid, and everything had changed so much in terms of like daily routines, on a spectrum of experience for people. So I think the like a key thing was the sort of transparency in terms of feeling connected to what was happening, through being able to kind of look at each other's task list work plans, both in the sprint planning mural board that we had, and then through using Microsoft Planner for our stand-ups, so that people could see what each other was doing had a benefit. What was really, really important, and which the team really took on with great commitment and care, was the being a critical friend, which I think is Hale's phrase, like being a critical friend to each other in the sprint planning, going, right, so for 5 minutes, someone is going to look at all my tasks that I've said I'm going to do in the next 4 weeks, alongside all the time I've said that I'm either out delivering workshops or on leave or whatever, and they're going to go, Ro, that is not realistic. Like, some of these things they can't all be top priority, first of all, and also, even if you rank them, you physically couldn't do all of those things. So, and then in the stand-ups, to kind of go, people go, right, well, today I'm doing this, 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 and this, and then people go, that one thing seems like it might take 2 days on its own, and you said you were read this like first thing we asked you, like, how things are going, you said, like, yesterday was a kind of write-off, it went kind of, you know, things happened. And so that people could be really supportive in terms of, and we had a team culture where that was really supportive. It was all about kind of going, how can we help you do the work that you want to do and look after yourself? What role can we play in looking after you? So I think that became important. And then several people started adding on initially, like on our kind of what we're doing on our Kanban board, like we didn't have meetings and things. And then several people were like, started putting in their meetings, because they were trying to make the point that actually on Wednesdays, like I was quite regularly in back-to-back meetings from 9 till 5. So what task was I imagining that I would get done in that way? So, and then that helped people talk to each other about ways that they were planning their own work and things that they were trying out. And to go back to that learning thing, to share tools and things. Again, some of this was conversation that would have happened informally when we were all sitting next to each other. But also to help people feel like, if you feel like you're setting more realistic expectations for yourself, then you feel more productive, then you feel better about the work that you are doing, and you might like feel less stressed, or there'll be a cap on your stress. In addition, if you feel like the organization, as represented at this point by like the team, including the manager, are going, we want you to be realistic, we're going to help you be realistic, and all the rest of it, and we're going to identify if like we are part of a problem, or the organization, or I as the manager am part of a problem because I have unrealistic expectations, then again you create realistic accountability, but also accountability of the manager and the organization for like enabling people to do what they need to do and give them what they need for it. So those are kind of two kind of ways in which that enabled those conversations that I think probably had really great impact on efficiency and well-being, because they are inherently tied to each other. Because it's not efficient if people are having to work hours and hours and hours beyond their contract to get something done. That's not what I call efficiency. And if an organization or a manager isn't giving people what they need, or acknowledging that what they need doesn't exist and so they're making changes, that's not accountability. Both of those things are really important for people's kind of well-being, if that makes sense.
Totally. And what's coming out really strongly is that accountability and well-being wasn't, the responsibility for that wasn't on your shoulders as a manager anymore. It was on the individual, with lots of support from the team, critical friending, as well as sort of reflecting back what they're seeing, and that happening in the team environment rather than happening one-to-one with you.
Yeah, and I think, you know, the whole thing started for me because something was blocked with me. So on the one hand, that creates more opportunities for people so that they don't have to be as reliant on somebody, a manager in a one-to-one, having the right questions or the right ideas, but also people don't have to be so self-reliant that they're not having the space to, you know, great coaching comes from people coming up with their own understanding, developing their own understanding, developing their own solutions through conversation. That's exactly what was happening. It was the dialogue that then took place, but also people being able to be firm with each other, fairly firm sometimes, and going, right, well, if you do all of this in a month, you won't be able to sleep. And we don't think that's okay. So it also had to be grounded in initially shared like values and understanding that we already had before we came. But definitely that bottleneck of it not sitting, and then it freed up conversation in one-to-ones with me, where we weren't necessarily always having to look at those things, or I could see where there were issues that I wasn't aware of, and so therefore could pick that up in one-to-ones. And certainly when I was then job sharing, that we could much more easily pick those things up with and for each other as a job sharing managers, because some of the stuff had been dealt with already, and some of it had been flagged that perhaps we wouldn't have been aware of, or we would have had to wait until the next kind of one-to-one. So yeah, I think it had a pretty good impact, but it did need, we couldn't have leapt into it. Other teams I've managed couldn't have leapt into that without more preparation than we had, I would say.
Thank you. You touched on there how your role changed as a leader, and I want to come back to that in a moment. But before we do, I noticed you said, someone said, I'm a red. Would you, or I was red yesterday. And that's a lovely tool that the team use to, again, to sort of refocus regularly and check in around wellbeing. Would you talk us through what you meant by I was a red yesterday?
Yeah, and it was also great for connection as well, because when you're not all in the same physical space, you don't see what is happening. Actually, it's one of the things that was great for my well-being, not always being in an open plan office. So I wasn't always aware all the time of what was happening. But so in our stand-ups, the first thing we would do, and this was a structure that you both gave us, people would assign the previous working day, which obviously wasn't always the previous day, as red, amber, or green. And I don't think that had Julia come to some of our later conversations, there would necessarily have been agreement as to what we counted as amber. I think we were more often red than we sometimes like to say. Like, there was a psychological element of going, I don't know if I really want to say I'm red because I didn't quite get everything done, but I feel like I got most of my to-do list done, and therefore, like, and so that in itself exposes like cultural things as well as individual things about expectations. But what we would say is, I had a to-do list for Monday, and something happened first thing on Monday morning, and then I was drawn into that all day, and so I didn't get anything done. So that was red. And what happens in that instance is, especially for people working with a manager, if it's me that was saying it, is it immediately makes people aware of something they might not have been aware of, obviously within bounds of what's professional and appropriate, and so on. But it enables people to know, especially if they've got interested in progression and things, in terms of touching the sides of the job, being aware of the job, that sometimes something will happen. A senior manager will send you an email on Monday, and then that is your Monday wiped out because you're a middle manager and you've got to deal with whatever it is you've been given to deal with. So it would help in that sense. Sometimes people go amber, probably what they really meant was red, because they got like they were making really good progress, and then in the afternoon they were really tired, or they had a headache, or something happened, in the home, or something was distracting, or just they'd been, especially if it was like maybe a Thursday, and actually they'd been running training Monday to Wednesday, and so of course, so in that instance, what would happen was people would say, well, of course, yeah, like, you must be tired. Have you thought about taking, like, have you got time to go for a walk or have a nap? Like, what is it that you need? And then what needs to happen to enable that? Because there is a fundamental shared understanding that productivity isn't about being high performance all the time. In fact, it's the opposite of that. It's like the Simon Sinek thing of ahead days and behind days. I'm like, there are ahead minutes and behind minutes, and that's fine. Like, that's absolutely fine. That is not a judgment on your performance. So that people then feel, especially new people coming into the team, saw like senior people like managers, but also then more like people who've been around for longer, saying those kinds of things, being honest and transparent in a fairly safe space, and therefore and being met with care, I think. And so I think that was a really important dimension of it as well. But that was what the red, amber and green. And then everybody would be delighted if somebody said, yesterday was green, I got everything done, and everybody would be like, hooray, that's amazing, and how did you do it, and like, how does that feel, and what does that mean, you know? Yeah.
Thanks, Ro. Yeah, we find that such a beautiful tool for enabling, again, sort of shared accountability on realistic work planning, and then enables conversations of support around that, and potentially reorganisation of work if you're finding that the red days are often happening to the same people and the green days are often happening to the same people. Yeah. What can we do to rearrange things? Thank you. Lots of love for this in the chat. I'd love to come back to how your role changed or needed to change to enable all of this. With a lot of what we've talked about as a way that you found agile ways of working enabled more sort of connection, accountability, responsibility, well-being within your team, was because the conversations that you were used to having one-to-one with each team member around workload, around how they were doing, were now happening within the team, within the network of the team. How did your role change? How did you feel about it?
Yeah, well, we had conversations about this. So interestingly, right at the start of 2020, before everything, I was in a management development program at Amnesty with other middle managers, and we were assigned a couple of coaching sessions, and my coach said, let them learn, let them lead, which is essentially like, get out of the way. You know, all you've talked about is how high performing the team is, how connected how well functioning the team is, and all the rest of it. So like, how are you going to get out of the way? And the way that we were using agile, the way that we were using the kind of scrum techniques, was all about kind of collaboration and connection and transparency and flattening that out. And I was very aware, though, that also I was paid to do a job. I was paid more to do a job, to have more responsibility and have more accountability. And so therefore, what was like the ethical balance of some of that? Because we see it sometimes, don't we? Like, there are things that are development opportunities, and then there are things that are exploitation, and there are things where you'd like, depending on the time of day, it looks like one thing, looks like another. So I spent a lot of time kind of trying to reflect on that separately from what was happening, so that I didn't get too in the way, and occasionally bring that into the space to kind of go like, what is it that people need, and certainly in one-to-ones, like, what is it that people need, so I could keep connected with like the team's needs of me beyond like the obvious around, you know, resourcing and dealing with whatever else is happening in the rest of the organization, which was like a part of my job, was like dealing with that. And middle managers are filters, they're filters upwards and they're filters downwards, and that's what we're paid to do. So I spent a lot of time, and I don't know really and as I say, it was a sort of player manager role, and so I think all I did was reflect on that, try and consciously reflect on that regularly. And I guess it helped that I'd had like this 3-month sabbatical, and so came back in, big decisions have been made without me, which and then we were starting this, so I'd had a bit of a kind of reset moment. I think that helped. And then, but actually, like, mostly I think it was very good for my well-being, because I didn't feel always like I had to hold absolutely everything in my head, like literally, because, you know, we had things mapped out on Mural, and we were then using Mural for lots of things, and especially in remote working and hybrid working, where you couldn't rely on people to have those informal conversations with each other over desks and in like making tea and whatever. in the same way, because it felt very formal to go, hey, shall we like put in a conversation and a cup of tea? That felt like very formal to people, and took a while for people to get used to across our organization. And so when it came to, making plans, capacity planning for unexpected changes and priorities, unexpected absence, all the rest of it, I felt like one of the things I didn't have to communicate was what was the bigger picture was, because everybody always knew what the bigger picture was, roughly speaking, to a greater or lesser degree. And so therefore you could more quickly move to, here are the things that I need to solve because it's appropriate for me to do that, and here are the things where I need to I can present to people and go, right, this is happening, we've got this information, what do people think? If we move things around, we've said these are the priorities, are these still the priorities? Great. If these are the priorities, who are we moving on to what? And therefore, what is the impact of that? And everybody was involved in that conversation. And then I was still accountable for is that the right decision? How to make it happen, and so on. And the really, really key thing was, could people take the time they needed when they wanted to for beautiful things like sabbaticals, parental leave, extended leave with family, especially, traveling as the things change with the pandemic, as well as the unexpected, the unplanned, the kind of less beautiful things. And I guess one of the things is, in spring this year, I ended up with the best part of 6 weeks off work. And part of that was enabled for me to take the time I needed, being a job share, but also because of the agile way of working. I just don't know if it had been spring 2021, I just don't think I would have been able to say to myself, I'm just not ready to go back to work yet, and not go back to work. And I'm hoping that is the reality for other people in the team, that kind of ongoing developed connection, collaboration, care enabled people to go, somebody, and also not just if it's one manager, not just the manager, because people worry about managers, which is lovely. Also not what people pay to do, but it's lovely. And so being able to go, the team will handle this because I was involved in making it happen when it needed to happen for somebody else in the team. And again, that around beautiful things as well, so that people feel enabled to, prioritize aspects of their lives more kind of readily. That was my experience of it. Of course, that might not be.
I remember one of the team saying something along the lines of, oh, now I can go on holiday and know that my projects are continuing without me, rather than knowing that you have a mad panic before you go on holiday and everything's going to be backing up while you're away and you're going to come back to a tsunami of work. So yeah, that well,
it's only reliant on one other person, the one other person who's, because of the kinds of projects we were doing, certainly at the time, it's only reliant on one other person, either the manager, because it's the manager's job to cover when people aren't in, which is quite right, or the one other person who's working on the project, which puts a lot of pressure on them, for sure. And that is, there was no reason with the kind of work we did, there was no reason why that shouldn't be the case. I used to work in schools, that's a different kettle of fish, different teams, different kettle of fish, and all the rest of it. But there was no good reason why that should have been an insurmountable problem. It just sometimes requires the way of working and finding the right way of working that connects to values that are shared, I think, is the key thing.
Shortly I want to hand over to everybody else to ask what other questions there are in the room, but I know something that we've talked about before, Ro, that I'd love you to share a little more around is, the example that you've shared, you had no choice in a way than to change your ways of working because of the pandemic, at least to, that there was no choice in the fact that you had to now work remotely and adapt to that. something that I hear a fair amount when working with other folks is them sort of saying, how do I prioritize this kind of move towards agile ways of working when there isn't a pandemic to push it to the top of your priority list? And I'd love to know, what do you think about that? What would you say to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I was talking to somebody about this the other day. You know, a lot of change was initiated in organizations in 2020 and 2021, not only out of necessity, but because there was an environment of so much change that it made some innovation possible in a way that it wasn't before. And then we saw afterwards, like, more an increased resistance to change. That is my observation, that it wasn't just like necessity is the mother of invention, but also when people are in a space of like having to innovate, it reduces resistance to innovation. So when I say change in that regards, I mean kind of positive change, or change that with a positive goal in mind. So we certainly benefited from that, and I think had it played out differently, and I've had this idea to work with these people, I've talked to these people, I think they're great, I think this would be really good for the team for X, Y, and Z for this particular project. I'm going off on sabbatical for 3 months, which I was always going to do, and then come back, and it hadn't been that. I don't know whether the appetite would have been there in the team that we had, but I don't know whether it would have been sustained in the same way. Having said that, I think that I certainly felt the benefits very quickly, and in relation to things that were really important to me and to my work, and that was motivating. And also, it couldn't get stuck with me, which was the key thing, right? Like, that was my starting point, that something had got stuck with me. It couldn't get stuck with me because everybody was involved. So, and because it wasn't one scrum master as well, everybody was involved. The rota was worked out for, you know, several months ahead. So it would have had to take everybody going, we don't want to do this, or we're not turning up, or that kind of quiet way of like, oh, I've got something else, of deprioritizing it. But that would have been very visible to everybody else in the team. So I think a commitment, and I think because it was so profoundly connected to people's values in the team, that commitment was there. It wasn't about, can we make this more efficient? It wasn't even about like, can we, which I think several of the team have talked in the chat about, like the impact on how we then collaborated with other teams, but it wasn't even about that. It was like about our team experience, our team identity, and our individual capacity in relation to our work. So in that motivation element of, you know, the Daniel Pink triangle of, you know, autonomy, which is also about like, how able do I feel to meet expectations that I have of myself, that the organization has of me, whatever it might be, of the sense of purpose, which is also like connection to why I do my work, but also why are we as a team doing our work, and how does that connect to like what we're doing as the organization. And then mastery, which is not a word that I like, but we think in terms of kind of expertise and curiosity and development, like those things that I'm also missing in a particular context. So I think a kind of a commitment to something that delivers on those things, which in itself delivers on motivation. And also, it was fun, and we could have a whole other long conversation on my profound like commitment and belief of fun in the workplace, by which I do not mean like social events at which, you know, some people are having a great time and some people are having a miserable time. I mean like play in the workplace, play in relation to the work. We also were able to have, was not always fun at all, but there was a playful element to it that was also kind of motivating. But there was also a structure to it, which meant that it didn't have to be loads and loads of additional work, especially as we got more confident with it. So I think it's always a complex mix of like why some things stick and why some things don't stick. But in terms of prioritizing it, I think it was about habit. I think it was about habit, and then the habits have benefits, and so therefore we kept doing them.
And one final question, which kind of builds on that, Ro, before I open up the floor to everybody else, for I'm sure you've got tons of questions for Ro, is something else that I saw you do well that I often get questions about is folks saying, how do I create a more agile environment within my team when my team is operating within an organization that is not working in this way? And that's something that certainly, you know, doesn't make Amnesty any different to many charities in the UK and globally. So what were some of the ways, what enabled you to create such a fun, supportive, accountable, shared culture focused on well-being within your team using agile principles within a wider organisation for whom that wasn't the priority at the moment?
Yeah, so I suppose the unhelpful comment is there were some specifics as to the origins of the team that enabled that. So like when I joined the team, it was a brand new team, and there was a lot of uncertainty, and there was a gap in the manager role, and so there was a lot of and there wasn't very much historical knowledge had been lost, and the people responsible for our team, like going further up the management chain, we were specialists and they weren't specialists in our area, because that's what we have been hired to do, right? Like so there was something about, and so we were like, what is it we think we should be doing? Let's start doing that. And then we did that well, and people were like, great, carry on. So there's something specific about that. But I do think within that there's an element of, we're a specialist team, and lots of teams are specialist teams. If not most teams, certainly most teams in Amnesty are specialist teams, whether that gets recognised or not. And sometimes the source of tension is that other people think they understand what a team does, and they don't, because they're not experts in that area. And so it was like within our field of control, within the work that we had not only responsibility for, but accountability for, where we were making the decisions. And so we made those changes, or I made those changes, and then those changes stuck in terms of the ways of working within the zone of my control and our collective control. And I think that's really important. And interestingly, I don't know that the team know this, but interestingly, like we weren't part of it, like nested in a bigger team, or which had like 2 or 3 other teams in. And there was a suggestion at one point that perhaps Agile would be brought in for that. And I was asked, because we were the only team doing Agile, and I said no. I was like, I don't want to do that, because that would have expanded the zone of control outside, like that, of what we were doing beyond our zone of control. And also, I didn't think that bigger team was ready for it. I didn't think the work was suited to it. I was like, I think individual teams, this could work really well for, but like this bigger team, I don't see how it would work. And then you would just be asking people to attend more meetings without a sense of it connecting to the purpose of their work, without them feeling like they had that like expertise, without them feeling they have that autonomy. And then it just becomes, then I don't think it would be sustainable. Doesn't mean there were no circumstances in which I could see it would be sustainable. And it certainly doesn't mean that I was right in that decision. I was just like, if we do this, I think it's going to wreck what we're doing. And that is too precious. So I think there is something about, and teams are often quite autonomous, really, because if you're turning out what the organization expects of you, then that's what I will say. And the team are better placed, especially Tom and Hale, to talk about this, I think, is when some of those techniques were taken into collaborative projects with other teams, then that became clear as to in what ways it helped and in what ways there were new tensions that we hadn't expected, because there were different ways of working, for sure. So I think it's a risk assessment job, which is like, what is it that we want to achieve? Like, if we do it in this way, in this team, what can be achieved? What are the risks? If we expand that, what can be achieved? What are the risks? And also you can scale it up, right? So you can change things. And as Julie said, you can experiment with things and make things your own. So what you need for it to work in a team is the buy-in of the team. I am a little bit of a rogue middle manager, so I don't always ask for the buy-in of my senior managers, and that is a strength and a weakness depending on who you are and what you think of the work. And so that is depending on your context. Yeah, I would say so. It's a bit of a messy answer to that one, except all I would say is I'm glad we did it.
I was thinking you could perhaps sum it up by a phrase that Julia and I both use often, which is ask for forgiveness, not for permission. And it sounds like you identified where you had control and you went ahead and just did it.
And the key thing there is, are you being ethical and are you being responsible?